Hello, I'm Ron Vogel. I'm president and CEO of the National Design Alliance and team leader for our program, Reimagine America's Schools. I want to thank our panelists and co-presenters today as we look at the coming together, the integration of technology and the design of the physical learning environment. For decades, technology has been a dominant influence in shaping the way we have approached teaching and learning. And while there are numerous examples of educators and architects that are creating new and exciting school designs, the vast majority of schools are generally designed based on a pre-tech model, where a specific group of students had to be in the same place at the same time to hear the same message. We are no longer bound by those limitations. Even where the most current technology is used, the learning environment often undermines its impact. But what does the new vision for 21st century learning environments look like? And how can technology and design work together to support improved student learning and greater equity in our schools? And this is no small matter, since school districts will be investing as much as $500 billion in school renovations and new school construction over the next 10 years. This is an important topic. So I want to manage expectations. Today's forum is just the beginning. With only 90 minutes, we do hope to raise some key issues and opportunities, but we will follow up with interviews with many of today's panelists to drill deeper on the ideas aired today. And over the next weeks and months, we will continue this process and ultimately craft strategies and guidelines for educators to implement in their communities. We're in the process now of identifying districts and communities that we would like to work with, so please consider today's forum an invitation to join us as we seek to find new ways to be innovative in your communities. Finally, we want to welcome our observers today and thank you for joining us. In the last 20 minutes or so of today's forum, we will be presenting a few questions from our observers, so please send your questions through the chat function. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists. From the Calcasieu Parish Schools, former CTO Cheryl Absher. From BCG Plantinian, Ashley Arhart. The Digital Innovation Strategist at Perkins & Will Architects, Satya Basu. Marilyn Dennison, K-12 Education Planner, DLR Group. Welcome, Dr. Dennison. Daniel Foreman, Associate Director of Professional Learning at Digital Promise. Ace Parsi, Director of Innovation, the National Center for Learning Disabilities. Lisa Ramirez, Chief Innovation Officer, Lubbock ISD. Welcome, Dr. Ramirez. Dr. Keisha Ray, Strategic Advisor, K20 Connect. John Sievertson, architect from Chicago, Illinois. Welcome, panelists, and thank you for joining us for today's convening. And it's now my pleasure and privilege to introduce Josh Elder from the Siegel Family Endowment, who will co-moderate today's conversation, followed by Richard Coletta, CEO of the Society for Technology and Education, ISTE, who is co-hosting today's forum.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Ron. My name is Joshua Elder. I'm the Director of Grants Management at Siegel Family Endowment. And Siegel Family Endowment is really excited to be a part of this conversation today with Reimagine America Schools and ISTE. I think for us, this topic of the future of learning at the intersection of technology and design is such a timely and really relevant topic that we've been discussing internally as a team at SFE. And so just to give you some brief context as to why this was really interesting and we were excited to partner, at SFE, we are really focused on understanding and shaping the impact of technology on society. And we really do that through supporting organizations kind of working at the intersections of our three portfolio areas, which are learning, workforce, and infrastructure, and also our view of reshaping infrastructure, which you'll hear me talk a little more about, and taking into consideration kind of three aspects of the human, physical, and digital infrastructure, which aligns really well to the conversation today. We're excited because this intersection of thinking about learning and infrastructure and what this looks like and just is really important, I think, given the current state of affairs that we're all facing with education, and just really happy to have all of you from such a diverse and wide range of backgrounds to kind of hear your viewpoints and thoughts as we take on this really important topic and conversation. And just really thank you all for being here, as well as everyone that's attending. Excited to hear from you and see where the conversation goes today.
Thanks, Josh, and thanks for working with us. We've had fun getting to work with you personally, and excited about opportunities that we may have together going forward. ISTE is an amazing organization. I've known about it from afar for a long time. I used to be a president of the school board, and we bought a lot of computers, and we would learn about things from the International Society for Technology and Education. And then comes along Richard Coletta, who was hired, I don't know how long ago now, Richard, to run the organization. And Richard and I first met when he was with the Obama team at the White House, and is bringing extraordinary and important leadership to this topic, and brings, I think, a real understanding of the connections between design and technology. And so, Richard, thank you, and thanks to your team for helping us put this together today. Welcome to your members that are on the panel, and welcome to you. And this is your moment to make your opening comments, and turn off your microphone and let us hear from you.
Well, thank you, and I will keep them brief because I really am here to listen more than to talk. But first of all, we're just honored. ISTE is thrilled to be participating in this very important conversation with Reimagine America Schools, and also very grateful for Josh and your support from the foundation to be able to make this possible. This is a critical conversation. I think the one part I would add, if I could just maybe give one opening thought before jumping into the conversation here, is we've been in this mode for a while of kind of emergency reaction, right? And it's because we're in a place that we needed to be, right? There was an emergency, there is an emergency. And so we've spent a lot of time in emergency mode. And as important as that is, we also need to not lose track of the broader conversation around effective learning that we need to be thinking about beyond the next month or two or three, but over the next 5 to 10 years, right? And one of the things that we know is that learning environments are critically important, right? We know this from tons of research. The environment, if it is set up in a way that's appropriate for learning, is incredibly powerful and enabling, right? And we've been in a transition mode between physical learning spaces that had no technology and a very tech-rich environment. And this is pre-COVID, right? This is already a transition that we were doing. COVID has accelerated it, but it has not changed the general trajectory that we were moving anyway, right? It just maybe moved some things along a little faster. And what we have not had enough time thinking about is the intersection of those two. What do effective learning environments look like in a world that is highly technology infused, but a world that also has a very real physical presence to it? And I think that's the shift that we need to make. And I'm just thrilled to be part of that conversation here. I put as my background the high school that I went to school in because I thought it was appropriate to remember the classrooms. This was South Kingstown High School in Kingston, Rhode Island. Those are the learning spaces that largely haven't changed in many, many years. If you were to walk into that school today, despite the fact that I was there 100 years ago, it would still look very similar to what it had been. And so we need to be very bold about the conversation about what does the future of learning spaces look like when physical and digital space are blurred. And I'm thrilled to be part of that. And from an ISTE standpoint in EdSurge, which is our reporting team, we're really excited about helping to highlight the messages that we share today. So that's enough for me. Excited to be part of this great conversation.
Great, Richard, thank you. And Josh, thanks again. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank our partners at CityAge who work with us on our outreach work and our communications, and also the Schmidt Futures organization, Eric Schmidt's foundation, who has underwritten our efforts. Oh, Dan, I can see your eyes are, oh, no, Cheryl, okay. Turn off your mic.
Well, as Richard and Keisha know, I am never shy, and I was so thrilled when an outreach came to me to ask me if I wanted to be part of this, because I am certainly not the youngest person on this call, but I've been doing this for probably over 30 years in ed tech, and the key for me is we have been fighting an uphill battle, and we have been trying to convert non-believers for a couple of decades. And because I was a teacher, librarian, school principal, and CTO for almost 25 years, built a whole district and helped the state build infrastructure, then people were like, well, that's for sure. We don't need any of that technology. I have my lesson plans. I know how to teach. My children pass the test, and I don't need no darn stinking computers. So what's happened is that flip has occurred. And now everyone that we tried to drag to drink the water, and they put a toe in and went, don't need that. Now they're in the deep end of the pool, and some are drowning, some have started to swim. But the key is everybody has to be, take the first aid Red Cross lifesaver course, because they all have to be master swimmers to help our students. And so for me, I have not viewed this whole remote learning, pandemic closed schools as the most negative thing that's ever occurred on the planet. To me, it's still glass half full. People are now realizing what we've been preaching from the mountaintops, that technology is the great equalizer and enabler of education for all of our students. And so I'll stop there, Ron, because I have another piece that I want to drill down into about equity. But I don't see this as being horrific and bad other than personal tragedies. But in terms of education, we flipped and people are now coming to the light. And I'm okay with that.
So Cheryl's going to be using a lot of water analogies since she just went through a hurricane, and so swimming, flooding, drowning, those kinds of things. So we got that. Thanks for sharing that, Cheryl. And I think Richard's comment about being future focused is really important for us as well, learning from where we've been and trying to figure out where we're going to go. Our governor here, Governor Cuomo, said, technology is so great, why do we need all these buildings? And recently, Eric Schmidt said, the technology is now sufficient that we can educate billions of people. And that sounds like the sound of one hand clapping. Where is this going to happen? How does it happen? And that's what Reimagine Schools, America's Schools, is focused on. How do we create learning environments that support this extraordinary asset that we now have in technology? Who would like to open up with comments? Yes, Ace.
Yeah, I think I will just build on that behind what Cheryl just said and also what Richard mentioned, because I think that to me, like, we just released a report we titled Promise and Peril. And I think that both of those aspects are very real. There is promise here and there is peril. And I'll talk about a little bit about, since Cheryl talked about the promise aspect of it, which I agree there's definitely promise. To Richard's point about learning environments, I think the one thing that we can't lose sight of is that the blackboard at some point was a technology. The overhead projector was technology. The computer was technology. So while this feels completely new, we have had technology, and not all technology and the uses of that technology have fundamentally transformed learning, because what we need to talk about is the learning environment and the quality of the pedagogy and the experiences. So I would say I don't think technology is not necessarily the great equalizer. It could actually widen opportunity gaps based on how we implement that technology and how the quality of and the depth of the learning experiences that happens. And I think that should be fundamentally clear in these conversations. And I know that, like, for the populations that I represent from an equity standpoint, students with disabilities, of course there's the opportunity. Technology with assistive technologies provided new channels in terms of accessing learning. It has removed that in that providing access, reduced stigma. It provided deeper engagement, but it has also done exactly the opposite. If a child is using technology in a certain way or doesn't have access to it, that could actually widen the opportunity gap. If the teacher doesn't know how to implement that for all students through a high quality pedagogy, you could see those opportunity gaps widen. So I think that the reality is that, over millennia, we have taught young people through in-person education. There's nothing more fundamentally human that we do short of childbirth than educating somebody. And so I think that we need to walk into this at the same time with some humility, that there's going to be social emotional learning issues that are going to emerge because of the pandemic. There's trauma informed issues, and some of that is going to need really human that human interaction as well as high quality pedagogy, and we need to be able to acknowledge that in the conversation.
I do feel like you said something interesting there, though, about the kind of technology that was already embedded in the learning experience and in the learning space, which was more infrastructural. And one of the big shifts we've seen in just basically since 2007 is personal technology, right? It's like everyone now has these devices, and the ownership of technology has changed somewhat. And as a result, too, a lot of the disruptors we've seen in the world have been focusing on interface, right? They've been changing interfaces with this digital technology that everyone walks around with a interconnected, web-connected computer at all times, which is why Uber exists, right? It's like the act of getting into a taxi cab hasn't changed, essentially. Like someone gets into a car and drives somewhere and someone else is driving. It's just how you hail it, how you do, who the person on the other end is, right? And so I do think that we've been at war a little bit with, how does personal technology enter the physical classroom? And this is coming from seeing a lot of classrooms where the first instruction is put your phones away, right? But yet, it's like, that's where it's like, that is like this really, and, it's disturbing how dark these patterns are, right? Of like, how much the technology grabs students, but, sometimes it's like, we're telling them to turn off the part of their brain that is being engaged by tech companies and social media to try and bring them into an experience that, again, is an interface that is about kind of singular technology, right? It's about the blackboard, it's about the projector screen, all eyes on one person, right? And I think there's things we could start to do to start to leverage that interactivity of personal technology and the built environment as well as outside the built environment.
I'd like to jump in here and leverage some of those points and perhaps set a more extreme aspiration for how we might think about technology in this context. We have a tendency to anchor on technology as objects in physical space. I'd actually like to kind of be a bit provocative and suggest that we think of the space itself as a technological entity. There are a couple of mental models that I think could be really helpful. The one is a system of record, and a system of record that we're all very used to kind of interacting with, to your point, Satya, is interfaces. We touch keyboards, we touch screens. Imagine a system of record that is actually three-dimensional, spatial, and you are operating within it. And it is still capable of understanding human inputs, perhaps gesture, proximity, identity. And then a system of intelligence, and of course, systems of intelligence that we're all used to working with today and are certainly extraordinarily useful in remote learning are different software products. And imagine a software product that is capable of stitching together all of the activities that are going on in physical space, and also integrating those more traditional software inputs that we do have access to through personal technology. And imagine a physical space that is intelligent and actually something that we can collaborate with. And to your point, Satya, I think it's really interesting to think about. Imagine that space not necessarily having a whole lot of screens and pixels behind glass, as we like to say in design, but being more fundamentally intelligent and helpful and useful to the people participating in that space. So it's really interesting. Cheryl started us out with a very exciting but foundational hurdle that we have been able to overcome. And one of the really interesting and I think challenging things about this conversation is that the spectrum of possibility is so broad. We have people that need to embrace the basics in many ways. And then we have this remarkable opportunity to really transcend the understanding that we currently have about what right looks like in an educational environment. And Ace, you said something that I think is doubly important the more aspirational this conversation becomes, which is the ethical implications of beginning to move that direction. I've done a significant amount of work with computer vision and sensing technologies, and we very specifically stay away from children because of the ethical implications of working with them in these technologies. And as soon as we start to step into this space, I think we have to be very aggressive in terms of understanding the implications, the ethical implications, frankly, the legislative work that's required. It is lagging far behind the technology and the sophistication of the technology. So what I find so remarkable about this conversation is not only the impact we could have, but also the remarkable sense of urgency that I think it begins to push back into the technology and frankly architectural realms too, to catch up with this stuff as quickly as possible, because the possibility and the potential is so amazing and the implications are so profound if we don't wrestle with the implication and the human aspects of incorporating these sorts of technologies simultaneously.
Ashley, I'm going to jump in just really quickly, and Ron, I promise I'll be concise. But what you said around the ethics of students, the policy is so far behind the technology that those of us that are in school districts and work every day with school districts, we can't see it. And that's the dilemma. Ron, as a former school board member, you know deeply about the impact and the power of school boards over what happens within school districts and schools. And we've got a lot of education to do if we're going to reimagine education with policymakers all the way from the local, state, and the federal level, because they are experts in school, and that is because they attended school one time. And so, Ashley, bravo to you. Keep pushing, but we've got to work on the policy.
Ashley, let me build on something too very briefly that you said that I just want to make sure we don't lose it, and that is you brought up this point about so design, and we have some very talented designers on here, and I hope in a minute we'll also hear about some real practical guidance that you could give us educators for thinking about how we design space. But we put a lot of attention into the design of physical spaces, right? When we build a school, we spend a lot of time getting it right. You don't open a door and have it fall down a flight of stairs that's right there that you didn't expect, right? You don't have walls that if you push the button the wrong way, they fall down on you. They don't, right? Like we have all these things that we expect in the design of our physical spaces. And yet we have not held that same standard of design to a lot of the software that we're willing to put in front of kids. And so we have the digital version all the time of them clicking a button and they fall down the stairs, right? Or the whatever, of this clunky, weird environment and buttons that don't work, or if you hit the back button, you log out and all. And I do feel like we've become a little sloppy, a little bit. Our standard of expectation for the design of virtual environments is low. And I would hope that as we think about our role both on designing physical and virtual environments, that we're also not willing to accept just crappy design when it comes to virtual spaces, and that they should be intuitive and, as Ace mentioned, accessible and just inviting spaces. And I do think there's some work that we need to do there. So I just wanted to underline that before moving on.
And I'll jump in at this point. I appreciate you bringing us back around to design, Richard. Prior to me joining DLR Group as their teaching and learning designer, I worked for a school district. I was the assistant superintendent for curriculum and instruction in Coppell, which is in Texas. And I worked with fabulous, because I saw that, Cheryl, architect Taryn Kinney from DLR Group. At the time, she was with another organization. But because I was in a district with a leader that was also very visionary and wanted to make sure his words about wanting to transform, really, we kind of walked that as well, not just spoke about it. So as we designed a school, Taryn Kinney was alongside with me. We really talked about vision, and we worked on the instructional side first before we really brought in facilities, which was a different way of designing for schools. And environment for the school that we were building ended up being very technology rich, but the part of that was only part of it. It was really about the learning that we wanted to happen. So it was the focus on learning. So the school, long story short, is a very open collaborative space for elementary, pre-K through fifth grade. Right now we moved to pre-K out, but kindergarten through fifth grade. And these students all have an iPad. They have space that is a large group space. They have a small collaboration spaces that are very transparent. So you can send the kids in, you can see visible learning happening all the time. There's little space nudges that encourage kids to go into small groups or individual areas that they can do more reflective type thinking, working on by themselves. And the students are just working fabulously through this school. No fixed technology. We wanted everything to be very movable. So every space, every wall could be either a writing space or a projected space, or can be utilized differently. So it was taking the fixed piece of technology that we've always had before, making it very flexible, adaptable, movable, and an environment that will transform itself to that. The other piece to that, we were very intentional about the teaching and learning that was going to happen in that, and Daniel be happy to know we use digital promise a lot, and this school was a challenge-based school. We all had some form of inquiry type learning happening in the school district. When we did go to emergency learning, this school district, those that were really strong in their inquiry learning, they were able to transfer to remote learning much more quickly because the students already knew how to have ownership of their learning. And the design of the lessons were not just a substitution of a worksheet, but they were actually continuing on projects even though they were at home. And parents are at home and they're struggling with, how do I educate my kids? It's been a long time since I've been in this material, or I need to be at work also. Well, if the students already know how to learn, then it really helps the parents at home just to be that guide on the side as well, and not take over the role of the educator. So there's a lot of things that really go into this. And I'll let somebody else speak for a while, but I'll go into really more. I think the technology can still continue to help us as we move forward in this type of learning.
I can just add a little bit to what Marilyn said, because I do think that is the point of the design is so important in this conversation. A worksheet on a screen will save a tree, but it won't save a child. It's just still going to be the same sort of, it's not innovation, it's the same sort of education. And that's why I think it would go back to issues of pedagogy, strong pedagogy, whether it's facilitated by technology or not, and we can't lose pedagogy within flashy tools. But I think that the other thing is that were mentioned by others is just thinking about the environment, and also the environment is not just the physical classroom itself. There's a civil rights environment that protects our kids' rights. So for example, I think that I put in some stats that we just highlighted in our report, just totally shamelessly stealing from the Center for Online Learning and Students with Disabilities, which was run out of the University of Kansas, that examined online learning environments for students with disabilities. And it just highlights, the most states and districts haven't thought about those issues of accessibility in a really in-depth way. And we, as a community that really wants to push innovation to that end, must be demanding that ourselves. We can't just say, oh, we're innovating, therefore let's forget about all these civil rights laws that have protected kids' rights. In these environments, we have to also note where it's not working and why it's not working, and make sure that we hold the same high standard for our failures as any other environment. So for example, even before COVID, you had major virtual learning environments and virtual learning programs that had graduation rates in the 40%. If that was in a physical brick and mortar school, that would be called a dropout factory. We need to call it the same thing if it's in a virtual environment. And we need to make sure that to that end, we're holding ourselves accountable for the results, not just the method of education for our students.
Hey, may I hop in now? Yes, thank you. So one of the things that I'd like to add to this conversation is with respect to the foundational challenges. I know we've mentioned a couple of times already that the foundational challenges have been overcome. And I'd like us to just step back for a second and look at this through the lens of equity. As we make these assumptions, we also have this opportunity to look at our different community plans and revisit the assumptions and the limitations in which that plan was written. We have now learned in very quick order that although every child in our district has access to a Chromebook, and we provided hotspots for students, what we have learned is there are even more foundational pieces that some of our students did not have. And that could be a simple thing such as electricity, having literacy, computer literacy skills, actually knowing how to use this, having supports that are built in that will help them to continue to demonstrate student growth. And so when we think about this new space that we're walking into, and I don't want to really say new because blended learning has been something this particular district has been working with for some time, it is important that we think about whether or not we're actually giving the students true options rather than false choices. They will never be able to access, and even if they select the box to go in the virtual platform, they will not be growing at the rate that they'll need to be competitive. So that's one piece of the equity aspect of it. The second thing with regard to policies and just the way that we interact with each other across the country, across the globe, is really giving our schools and communities the language to articulate the different dimensions that we're talking about. We are not using the same terms when we're thinking about this. So even as we look at new reports coming out, we're not all on the same page with that. So those are things that we're working on right now, and we continue to track that. This has become quite important for us as over 72% are low socioeconomic. So we have gaps that we cannot turn a blind eye to. And we want to move our technology and say, even post-COVID, this is something we're keeping. This is something we will continue to grow in. This has given us an opportunity to revisit the tools that we do have and use all of it in a more meaningful way.
John Sievertson, what can an architect and a technology expert and an educator do together that they may not be able to do separately? If you think about pedagogy, technology, and environment as a closed circuit, how might that change the way architects engage and approach their designs of schools in this instance?
So let me try to answer that, Ron, or maybe I'll put it this way. Maybe the answer to your question will be embedded with a thought I have to share. And if it's not, then you can send me a nasty text.
Or you can ignore my question like a politician and just say whatever you want.
No. I think you're asking kind of a key question, but I'm kind of focused on this, just the, and I think, Cheryl, I love the way you started out by suggesting that this whole completely rethinking of education and learning, the flipping of the classroom, et cetera, is a ball that has been rolling for a while and gaining steam. And I think we all see the acceleration of that with COVID. And so I'm focused on this moment of COVID, Ron, and I think there's something magic that happens here potentially. I suppose looking for the silver lining. And I think that's something that we're all doing. And I kind of go back to maybe something you said, Ron, earlier, where a mayor may question, what do we need all these buildings for? And I wrote down a note to myself, and again, I'm an architect, so full disclosure, what do schools have to do with learning? And so I don't mean that. I think there's maybe a point embedded in that too, but maybe the question is, what do school buildings have to do with learning? And so what we've experienced in this past stretch of time because of COVID is we've sort of stripped away the physical space of a school from the experience of learning. And needless to say, we all know that when you do that, you lose something and you gain something. And I really feel like just analyzing a little bit or thinking through, and perhaps it's 99% anecdotal in my mind, you can see pretty clearly, you see space differently than you did before. And so now I'm thinking, so we've stripped it away and we're coming back. And I love the images of, I have grandkids who are going to school for the first time this fall, and they've got their backpack strapped down, they're putting their masks on, and they're not wanting to put their masks on, but they're going into the school and they're figuring it out, and they're charging up the stairs because they're in this new experience. It's an incredible moment of exploration and excitement. But I'm thinking about school space. I almost don't like to talk about design. And I know this is a problem for an architect, but I love a quote from Aldo van Eyck that I've shared with you before, Ron, that says that space in the image of man is place, and time in the image of man is occasion. And so now I'm imagining kids going back into the school for the first time after being online, having that experience and greatly extending their ability to kind of master the technology to do that as well as they can. Again, it's playing defense. And now they're going back into the school. And ultimately, the magic of the school is not the walls, it's the people and the interactions that people have. And that's what they miss so much. So they go back in and there are their friends again. There is a new teacher again. And so what if we said that going back into this space, we think of it differently as a place for occasions that didn't occur before, that bridge gaps in neighborhoods and address issues of equity, that flip the idea not only of the physical classroom, but that maybe we don't teach math and science, maybe we teach the nature of border conditions in the world or some crazy subject where all these things come together. And maybe we also say, I'm going to school on the north side of Chicago, but today I'm not just going to interact with the kids in my building, I'm going to interact with the kids on the south side and the west side. So I think there's a chance here to blow apart this whole question of what a school environment is. And thank goodness then that we had this pandemic to make us strip away the space for a while and come back and look at it freshly.
A good point, John. It does make us rethink space. And I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head of school is about the right space and not what we have seen for over time. I think Ron, you said at the very beginning, schools have just looked the same for so many years, or maybe it was Richard. And this is a great time to really look at the space differently. Instead of students, they're not as excited to come into a classroom where it's just the four walls and the desks are all facing the same direction and they're heavy and clunky furniture, and then to try to be collaborators and you know, entrepreneurs. It's hard to do it in that environment. So it's kind of, this is probably not the right term, but blowing up the schoolhouse and really looking at how we can change that space to allow for movement. We know research tells us that movement really helps students stay engaged, and engaged students are more apt to achieve what we're asking them to achieve. So we really want to hit that engagement. Those spaces need to be centered around engagement. We've done some study at DLR Group with the Student Engagement Index and Teacher Engagement Index to really measure how students and teachers feel about their space and how they're utilizing that. And we're seeing strong proponents to the space that allows students to move their furniture and to be into groups, to collaborate, or to be able to stand up and move, or maybe lay on the floor or lay on a couch. Whether they're doing inquiry learning or working on their technology or whatever, they're far more engaged and willing to stay with their task much longer. So we want to continue to look at space that allows for that movement and creativity and that really inspires learning. And I think that's our focus.
Marilyn and John, I could not agree more with the concept, but being a longtime teacher, and once a teacher, always a teacher, we've got significant work to do with helping faculty and school leaders to understand what this new environment could, but more importantly, should be. All the way back to the fact that we are producing young men and women out of colleges of education through alternative pathways to certification to teach that don't have any concept of what this looks like. And so the fallback position is to go back, I will teach the way I was taught, or the way I was coached during some type of practicum teaching. And so if we're truly going to redesign and rethink this, we need to think seriously about what kinds of significant, deep professional development do we provide for school leaders, district leaders, and certainly classroom leaders, because honestly, when the door closes, we are the, as teachers, you are the master of your own fate. And there's somebody who comes in maybe 3 or 4 times a year to check on you. But other than that, you are a rogue enterprise. And, I'm a big Star Wars fan, so I'm all about Rogue One and being rogue. But we've got to figure out some ways to encapsulate this and make it realistic and feasible and relevant for practitioners so that the work we are all, just celebrating that needs to be done really gets done. Because if not, that boat that's very comfortable, Ron, I'm going back to the water, don't rock the boat. People are going to revert back to the norm quickly because of everything else that's going on in their lives, in their work, in their job. And so I want to make the case for that. We've got to work harder to help practitioners and leaders think out of the box and sense the possibilities that we all are amening to.
But, and one of the things, oh, sorry, Josh.
No, go ahead, Satya.
I was going to say, one of the things that you're talking about is curriculum, right? And you made a comment early on about everything I'm doing is working because the tests are all good, right? And it's like, that's kind of a big problem, right? I mean, one of the things with this deconstruction of the school space enabled by technology, and obviously, iPads and, Chromebooks, these are all technologies that, tech companies are kind of foisting on schools, right? But beyond that is like the core fundamental technology. And we did some work investigating and teaching students how to basically build their own devices using smaller microcontroller, microbits, kind of Arduino and things like that, and connecting it much more to the maker space and encouraging students to develop a curriculum for themselves. Like, what are the questions and what are the things they're interested in their built environment and the questions they want to answer, and then teaching them how to build technology to do that. And then what we found when we tried to take it out of we started with one class, a series of classes, one school, then we did a PD and taught it to a bunch of other teachers to try and teach at their schools. And then what we ran into when we took it to the national level was kind of tell me which check boxes in the curriculum for computer science this checks off, because otherwise I can't even bring it to my principal to say I want to try something totally new, totally different, encourage students to design and create on their own. And that was a big kind of eye-opener coming from the design side for us of wow, it's it's not enough that it just checks the boxes of oh, this is computer science, this is engineering, this is art making. It has to literally fit inside this curricular box that's being devised. And, that's the first challenge, is expanding that curricular box so that it can take on more and have more freedom.
Yeah, I'd love to build off of what Cheryl has said, and I completely agree with you. As a former educator, I know that struggle, and a school leader as well. That struggle is so real. But I imagine people that are on this call today are having conversations, and I'm just really curious to hear, again, since we have such a diverse range of panelists here, just thinking about, and Richard mentioned this at the beginning, that this is such a great opportunity that we're rethinking and redesigning, not only for what we're facing, and John talked a little bit about this, seeing the silver lining of the pandemic, redesigning and rethinking for now, but how do you make this stick? How do you make this sustainable? Because we've always wanted to bring about these changes, and the ball has been rolling and rolling, but at some point the ball hits the wall and it stops, and then it picks up speed again. So how do we capitalize off of that? And then I think to Cheryl's point, but how do we recognize the real challenges that our teachers, our families, our school administrators are facing by just trying to make sure teaching and learning is happening? Whether or not is it today that students A through L are in the building? Is everyone remote? Just all the challenges that they're facing. How do we have this tension of let's push innovation, let's rethink this, but at the same time, the struggle is very real on a day-to-day. And so tips to how to navigate that, conversations that you all have had, or just advice for people as they're trying to undergo this process of how to just take these steps and have these conversations, but knowing the reality that's on the ground they're facing.
I can jump in on that. And I want to kind of reflect back on what Marilyn was saying, because where Richard and I intersected was when I was, we'll just call it a takeover agent in Nashville. And so, but what we did was really instrumental because we used blended learning, which at the time we didn't even have the framework. Michael and Heather kind of studied what we were doing, and we were incorporated into the framework that is now, so well known. But we used blended learning for the lift, and we redefined almost every single learning environment in the district of 200 plus schools. We took, our biggest stat is we took a 50% graduation rate to an 80% graduation rate in 6 years, which was really phenomenal and got a lot of praise from the Obama administration. So it can be done. There are models out there of where it's been done and where it's stuck. And in the COVID era, Nashville was one of the districts that on a dime was able to pivot. You didn't see anything in press about them because they had the infrastructure from 2003 to present to kind of do the work. We did a lot of stuff around professional learning, da, da, da. Fast forward to today, I'm working with New York and LA are the two primary districts I'm working with. And the chancellor in New York says, we're not going to waste this crisis. And both superintendents say, we're not going to ever go back to the way it was before. We are going to move forward, and we're going to move forward in a very aggressive way. And to that end, each district has negotiated new contract terms that enable teachers to move into this environment and have kind of guardrails on what is expected, which I think is very important because I can't remember who said it. It may have been you, Ace. Pedagogy has to shift, but it can't shift overnight, and you can't mandate it. So there has to be an evolution for the teachers. So one of the things I think I have enjoyed the most is the work I've done in LA, where we did a 12-week training of 40,000 teachers. And that training lifted up that district to where they had a very comprehensive understanding of kind of the new normal and how things are going to be from this point forward, grounded in research, grounded in, real great pedagogical practice, and grounded in tools. So we led with research, we followed it up with practice, and then we ended with, now here's some tools that you can use to make it happen. We did that in March and April, and I'm still getting emails about how beneficial that particular training was. And at the same time, they're thinking about what kinds of tools do we need. In each of those districts, there was a mad dash to distribute devices. It actually created, New York sent out 300,000 iPad devices, which made it impossible for anybody to buy an iPad for like months. So sorry about that. But what they realized is they were kind of a day late and dollars short on what they knew they needed to have done kind of 10 years to present. But now they're not going to waste any time, and they're not going to go backward. I do think that the physical environment, I just had a call with them this morning about kind of physical classroom environments and what the expectation should be there. And one thing that I'm suggesting is everyone should be grounded in an online environment. So all of your instructional materials should actually be online, and your presence in a physical environment should be for collaboration, for your social emotional experiences, for one-on-one consulting with a teacher or a peer, but not for instructional delivery. That is something you can actually get through an online platform. And those platforms, had a call with Google this morning too. They're speed racing to perfection. So you're going to see a lot of really great tools coming out. I do think we still have a gap with curriculum, and I think it's mostly because the way that we have to design and revise, especially online curriculum, is a very arduous and long process. So that can't be immediate, but I do know a lot of them are aware and are in the process of transforming. So I put in the chat, we're never going to be the way we were before. So just get that picture out of your mind. It's going to be different. We don't even know what the new normal is going to look like. We can't even imagine it. It's dependent on too much human error to really even calculate. So, but I do know that it will probably be a more invigorating experience for our students than they have ever had access to before.
Josh, if I can toss in another maybe follow-up to your question, and Keisha, listening carefully to what you said, I do feel as if there is a possible danger that this opportunity will end up being kind of a train wreck of wild possibilities. And I'm just imagining again, a child re-entering the classroom. They've just been at home learning with their parents. We all know that their parents are on the brink of insanity for having gone through that experience. That's true, but we're thinking about kids here. And they've just had an experience that they're probably going to look back on and say, this is one of the most wonderful learning experiences I've ever had in my life. So they're going back into the school, and I just feel as if that it's possible that we can get into too much complexity and too much motion too quickly, and that there's sort of a simplicity, maybe not serenity, but I think it would be not a bad idea to emphasize the fact that during this pandemic, our lives became pretty simple in some pretty interesting ways. And there's an enormous richness and value that we perhaps rediscovered. Let's not let the technology possibilities become produce too much commotion, and always be thinking. We should always be thinking not about the wonder of this tool, but about the very simple way that it may open up these interactions that may not have existed before. And I think that might be a difficult thing to discipline ourselves to do.
Couldn't agree
I
more,
want to go
John.
back and hit Lisa one more time, because she made a point in the chat that I think was critically important. And Lisa's not quite as mouthy as me, so she was typing it instead of writing it. But the key around the equity issue of connectivity for our students, you can, Keisha, as you said, you can have 300,000 iPads and you can give a lot of MiFi devices out. But if you live in a community that has no connectivity, or a rural area or an urban area that's oversubscribed, then our students are not connecting, and they don't know what blended learning is. They know what train wreck, I'm not doing anything, and living in an economically deprived area with some rugged things going on, maybe in my home or my community. So one of the things that, again, around this policy issue is that the FCC needs to think, and Keisha typed in the chat too, very differently about how do we use these massive amount of funds that are there to help with connectivity, to make learning really 24/7, and to make sure that there is an equitable learning environment for every child, because it's not just the device. If they can't connect to anything and McDonald's turns off their Wi-Fi at night, then some of these kids cannot connect. And so they are getting more and more disenfranchised by the minute. And if we have, as you said, Keisha, where you go into the classroom and you have coaching and you have collaboration, but you go home and it's a dead zone, then we have not done the best we can for the worst and most neediest communities in our country. And we should do better, and we can do better.
It's
I would
actually
just
the
add, I
crux of
think,
my program.
Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, no. So like in the
Please.
crux of my program, what I do is we provide devices and internet connection for every single student within middle schools, grades 6 through 8 across the country. I'm at 255 middle schools, and I'm adding another 100 at the end of this year. And what we do and what we have seen is I only go to schools that are at least 65% free and reduced lunch or higher. We're at like 83% right now for across the country for 250 some thousand students. And what we saw with COVID was like our schools were ready. They were prepared. They could just flip it and be able to move and start teaching and learning very readily. And to go back to one of the points that John brought up was like it really, and one of the cruxes of our program is that it's about the thinking, not the thing. The thing will change, but the thinking won't. And that's the idea that we have to really kind of move forward with. Is we have to be really aware of how we are utilizing space and how we are utilizing the learning ecosystem, because that's really what this is. And space is a part of that. And we have to be able to create an ecosystem of learning that empowers our kids, that is equitable to our kids, and is providing them access to what it looks like. Now, like there's a few truths that have come out of COVID. Like one,
The internet is a utility. It's not a luxury, especially if public education is requiring students to be able to learn online. That right there makes it a very simple argument as to why we need to do it as a public utility. The other piece of this is that if learning used to be the constant and time and space were always the constants as a part of that, well, now learning and learning and space are now the variables, and learning is the constant. And so now we have to really rethink about what we are doing and what the future will look like. So we've always had this idea of learning happening in a school within a space, and our entire public education system is kind of structured around that. All of the research is structured around that. And the belief is that that school over there is better than this school over here because my student needs to go to that space to be able to learn. We've torn down that wall. And now we have to be able to really rethink, what does DEIA work look like within a public education space to provide these learning opportunities for kids across the board? Every student should have the opportunity to have a challenge-based learning environment instead of a rote-based learning environment. Every single learning space we've designed for the past 100 years has always had a front, has always had a chalkboard, and is essentially 4 walls. We don't talk about the furniture. We don't talk about the internet. We don't talk about the electricity that has to go in to be able to power all of these things to be able to do it. And those are the things that we need to really be focused on. The other piece is transportation. What does transportation look like in this new environment? Because so much of school budgets is focused around transportation and getting kids from over there to over here to be able to learn. That is no longer true. And technically it hasn't been true in a long time, but now we have to rethink what that budget is going to look like and really provide what this will be. And does that school still have to be a very large building, or could it be a very small co-working space that looks more like a one-room schoolhouse in a local community that kids can walk to? Like, these are the types of conversations we need to start having.
Well, and
Everybody got
I would just like add to the to that conversation. I think this the idea, like, I'm very much come from an improv background, so I'll put a yes and to all that. I think that what I would say to add to that is that it's not, the revolution is not having Apple have a supply shortage because people are buying so many of their products. I wouldn't say the revolution is even the fact that we're going to create connectivity for all students. The revolution is the educational experience, and I think that we should not lose sight of that. I can just speak for my daughter who's about to head into kindergarten, but also other students with disabilities that we work for. This hasn't been a great experience for everybody. And we need to be able to say that it hasn't been a great experience all around. This has not been in all sense, sounds like this rosy, positive revolution. There have been really incredible opportunities where we've given students agency, and we have built on hands-on, relevant, applied learning opportunities. But there have also been very disconnected experiences. There have been students who have experienced great social isolation and online bullying. There's so many different things that we need to add to that conversation. So I would say if we're thinking that the device or the connectivity are the revolution, I think we're missing the ball on that, because I think that you need to think about what is the actual learning experience of the students. And then as far as we're designing schools, I know I've worked with partners with the National Indian Education Association and so many low-income communities. They're not getting food. They're not getting the physiological needs met. There are functions that the school serves, and collaboration and opportunities that the school functions that it's designed to meet. And we need to make sure that we don't lose sight of that as we're thinking about the content. And then lastly, and I promise this is the last one, is that we can't disassociate the learning from the social emotional aspect of it. So it's not that the student comes into the room in a virtual environment, learns the content, goes to the physical building to get the social emotional needs. Those things are inextricably linked. And I think as we design that pedagogy and design those experiences, we have to be incredibly mindful of some of the potential limitations and be strategic and thoughtful in addressing them.
So one of the things that gives this conversation urgency is a point that's been made numerous times. We can't go back to the way we were doing it before, but what does change look like, and how do we accomplish change? One of the facts that is almost startling is that in the next 10 years, we will be spending between $400 and $500 billion on school renovations and school construction. It's going to happen. Those dollars are either already in the pipeline or about to be in the pipeline. So we have an opportunity to leverage those investments with a new vision. Dan, I loved your idea that once we take the need for a central learning place out of the equation, what does learning infrastructure look like? And how do we think differently about that? And that's sort of what this conversation was beginning to think about today. How can we create a more dynamic set of ideas by bringing voices together, these today, for example, that don't usually talk to each other? How do we create an informed and exciting conversation that takes pedagogy, technology, space, the human and humane dimensions, all of the things we've talked about, and reimagine what that might look like? We believe that there are mayors and philanthropists and education leaders that are hungry for new ideas. And so through the efforts that we've made today and that we'll be making in the future, we hope we can provide those ideas and that inspiration to folks. And that means it's the end of the session, excuse me. We're now at the point where Heidi Ellis, who works for Richard at ISTE, has had the most impossible task. We talked the other day and I said, yeah, pick 3 or 4 questions that you can ask. Well, there have been hundreds of questions submitted through the chat format. So Heidi, good luck to you, but why don't you pose some of the questions you've selected for our panel?
Sure. Thanks, Ron. I thought, yes, there's been very robust discussion happening in the chat, which is wonderful. I tried to pull out a few nuggets, maybe talking about kind of what recently we've just been addressing, kind of looking about kind of like the new way of thinking about schools. What is the role of schools? You know, traditionally, you know, education is one piece of it, but, you know, kids go there for meals, you know, it's a safe environment, social emotional growth, all of that. So how are the lines blending between schools, families, and communities?
Who wants to tackle that?
I can start. I know just in the work that I've been doing currently, there is a lot more consideration when we're planning curriculum, when we're planning kind of the online environment. There's a lot more consideration of how we need to communicate and involve the parents and what kind of resources in particular we need to make available to parents. Common Sense Media has created this amazing resource called Wide Open Schools that both LA and New York are using. And that's just one example of how we need to provide some tools to parents so that they can kind of co-teach, if you will, with teachers. And I think, you know, another kind of conversation that we've had is once you've invited parents into this co-creation space, you can't uninvite them. So where we've been accustomed to telling parents and, you know, here's what we're going to do and here's how we're going to do it. And, you know, we may invite you to a committee on textbooks, but don't count on it. That ship has probably sailed too. And I think there's going to be a lot more inclusion of parents in curriculum selections and even classroom modifications, etc., than ever before. Not a bad thing. I'm a new parent and I can't wait to get involved in my child's teacher's business. But I think that, you know, the way that we had it before will not be going forward. And it's going to be a lot more of a partnership. And I put in the chat earlier, that's going to mean some parent training too, because parents probably need some background so they can participate in the conversations in a meaningful way and an informed way.
I agree, Keisha. Well said. And I'm looking at opportunities for maybe the schools to be considered learning labs for the community. So every school community is different from one another. However, our state curriculums or our high stakes accountability systems are consistent across. But we're really working with communities. So what if we are thinking of schools as learning labs for the community? The community is part of the schools. We're creating our students to be very supportive of the communities that they'll be moving, you know, career-wise moving into. But also what entrepreneurship would support the community? What is the community missing? we could start working with our schools to help support the community become, richer and more developed as we continue to raise our kids through our schools.
Keisha, I couldn't agree more that, it's like the Wizard of Oz, the curtain has been thrown open and now the parents have looked inside and go, what are you doing? What are you learning? What is she saying? They're watching the Zoom lessons and thinking, I thought she was great, but this is not good. So in many schools, we have that situation, but I want to harken back to my constant, my litany around so many of our children are in homes where either both of the parents are gone or the children need to be gone from the home for a certain period in the day to get some relief from situations. And so while we think of this new redesign, I think we have to understand that not only is it food and not only is it social emotional learning, but some of our children need to be in a school, a place somewhere, because there's nobody at home to watch them. The old idea of the grandmothers at home, living in the home, and, the parents go to work, those days are gone. Everybody's working if they can, pre-COVID, but these children need to be in a safe place with adult supervision and some type of learning coaching. And for many of our schools in Louisiana, health. We have health centers in our schools. Our children stay there when they're sick because there's no place for them to go. So school in its multifunctional levels, I think, will still exist. Certainly the curriculum, the instruction, the teaching and learning needs to shift, but our kids need safe places to go so that they're not, quite frankly, on the street.
And that's a kind of a separation, though, of like the school as the physical place, the daycare, the place where they get meals, the safety, the security, and learning. And, it's like maybe that separation or deconstruction is a good thing because, I think one of the things that the digital technology and, the Zoom life has kind of enabled is we can do things like this, right? We can like bring together a lot of people. It's a lot harder to hide. There's no back of the classroom, right? It's like there's an interface where you can see everyone in front of you. I actually just had a class today. I was teaching before lunch, and I could see every student's name. And it's the first time we're meeting, and there's something kind of freeing about like not forcing everyone to wear a name tag, but you can immediately jump in. You can have face to face. You can see the person and engage with them. And there's some things that could really start to change. Like, does it need to be one teacher to like 25 to 30 students, or is it more like cohort-based learning where you have different groups of people that kind of interact? And maybe parents get in that mix too, right? It's like deconstructing even the learning part of like the traditional day of like 9 to 3. That's the school day. It's like sure the like keeping parents or children safe from 9 to 3 under adult supervision while people worked 9 to 5 made some sense, right? But people don't work 9 to 5 anymore, and people don't live 9 to 5 anymore, and schools don't need to be necessarily serving that function 9 to 3 anymore. So like, let's see this deconstruction maybe play out across, it's like, is there evening cohorts, day cohorts? Do you have multiple students per cohort or teachers per cohort? And do you use the digital interface as well as the physical coming together of groups to basically spread out and diffuse the responsibilities, the learning, and the experience too for students, right?
We put just, you can be in charge. Do that, because that's exactly what we need and we want.
Okay,
So
that's a relief. That's a relief. Thank you.
Do it.
It's on me.
Ron, it's all on you.
Okay, Heidi, let's have another question.
Go for it.
Yeah, before we jump, I think Dr. Ramirez was just wanting to get in one word quickly.
Okay.
Yes, I just wanted to go back to something that Ace said about the social and emotional learning aspect. I think that we do need to just pivot a little bit. Primarily, we've been talking about the classroom teachers and the buildings or the space, but there are the counselors. There are so many others that we actually don't have really strong digital interface to work in that space. And that is something, we opened schools 3 weeks ago, face-to-face and virtual. And so what we learned immediately is that we needed a way to be able to help our students make sense of the racial and social justice, the whole unrest that we have right now. because they are not ready to learn until someone has dealt with some of that.
Mhm.
Being able to have the counselors have a public to be able to do this, it's outside of the regular time. Like that is something that's still kind of nebulous. And I'd love for us to be thinking about that. And I know we're going to the next question, but I do think it's a very, very important piece of the wellness of our students and their parents and the teachers. So I think it's something that we can't forget as we think about the interactions and who students actually interact with in a regular day. It's not just the classroom teacher. Thank you, Heidi.
Great, thank you. All right, pivoting a little bit here, maybe talking a little bit more to the architects and designers in the room, or everyone, but you know, it sounds like some of the questions coming out of the chat, we're talking about kind of like the physical infrastructure has traditionally been kind of supported within a school building. But as we're talking about, you know, kind of expanding what that looks like, how can we support the needs within the buildings, but also at home, in between? You know, are we thinking about that? You know, what do, you know, buses look like, especially for families with less resources? Are designers thinking about the full picture, not just kind of the traditional school building?
This is maybe an unsatisfactory answer, but I think Dan, you earlier referred to I think you said, maybe you used the term learning in maybe a garage, or
One
if
room
you didn't,
schoolhouse idea of wherever you could be, right?
yeah. And I think I did a pretty good job in school. And my desk was still bolted to the floor, and I had an inkwell that was, you know, not used anymore. But so I think, and I guess that means we can easily over concentrate on the school building as the place where we have to create design environments. And absolutely we have to, as Ron said, there's going to be $500 billion spent to improve these places. Well, of course we have to improve them. But I do love the idea of breaking down the boundary to say that collaborative project-based learning probably occurs more in garages than it does in classrooms. And that could happen on a school bus as well. And so in a way, a design problem is not just about a physical thing. It's more almost of an attitude that you bring to a whole range of experiences. And I think that's, to me, is interesting. At one point, I thought perhaps we could talk about not the design of schools, but the schools of design, where this kind of thinking is something which permeates everything that we do, or adds value, or adds a fresh perspective to many different things that we do. And that way learning actually can occur all the time. And it actually does occur all the time. That may be one of the other things that we learned or are learning because of the pandemic. So yeah, downplay the literal school, except that we've got $500 billion that I know I have to spend on.
I mean, it even goes down to as simple as like, why do we put regular doors on a classroom that with a tiny window that you can just barely see? That says a lot to a kid, and that says a lot to the environment of the school. Like, why don't we just tear down the wall and put in a garage door that you can see that is glass, and you can walk through and open the whole thing and bring everybody back in? It's a different way of thinking about like just how kids enter and leave a classroom, and now you have a more flexible space that you can now bring together. Now, like, is that any different than the stuff that we did in the 70s for the open classrooms? I mean, potentially, maybe. It all just depends. But the difference is we now have the technology to really tie all of these things together that we did not have back then. And for the first time, like these ideas around how can we rethink what education's purpose is and why we do it, like these are the things that we really need to be talking about. And like if we're moving in a completely remote and virtual environment, space becomes more important, the teacher becomes more important, and how we are having them engage with the learning is more important, right?
Mhm.
If the time of face-to-face learning is limited, then we have to really focus on how are we going to use that to the best of our ability. If kids are coming to school to do a worksheet, of course they're disengaged, of course they're going to be behavior problems, because the core of every behavior problem is an issue of engagement. So how can we really start to focus about that and making it a welcoming and inviting environment that is equitable to all kids, so that they can all have access to it that is within their local community, instead of having to go all the way over to this other side of the city to have essentially the same learning space. And I would say too, like I have to really think about our educators in the education community I mean, we look at what we asked them to do, right? Can you move into a virtual remote and learning environment in 72 hours? And they just did it, right? If they can do that, we can rethink learning space and rethink education to make something new and different when we actually have a much longer runway to get it done.
I totally agree with Dan. I think in terms of like just the spaces, like the two of the most innovative educational spaces that I've been in terms of like different site visits and case studies that I do, is one is the High Tech High Learning Campus in San Diego, California, and the other one is actually the Center for Advanced Research and Technology in Clovis, California, so Fresno. And those are two very different communities. But if you look at those two spaces, what they have done is actually very similar. I mean, they've brought use hallways for students to congregate together rather than getting in trouble. Like you have small learning environments and you have team teaching environments. And so much of what our classrooms are designed right now prevent that. You only have space for 20 kids in a classroom. You can't have two teachers come in and co-teach. So I think as we redesign our schools, we need to think about how do they facilitate the types of project-based, engaging learning experiences that we have. But to that end, again, I think we have to think about this as the pedagogy and the types of learning experiences and lead with that, and then think how technology facilitates that, rather than doing it the other way and starting with the technology and then thinking about how we fit our pedagogy within that technology. And I think that that's a different sort of paradigm shift than we need to be thinking about.
I'd like to add a nuance to this conversation, and this is more specifically for my fellow architectural designers on the team. My background is architectural design. I've functioned in more of a technology fashion for the past 10 years, but I think relative to the physical plant that is the school building, what we're actually presented with is an opportunity that's no less transformative than the inclusion of indoor plumbing and indoor electricity, or electricity generally. And when you think about the way architecture changed to incorporate these new utilities, Dan, I think positioning internet access as a utility is a really great foundational premise that we should all advocate for. There is an opportunity to truly reinvent architecture to enable technologies. Keep in mind, and we've seen it, right? We've seen how quickly technology has evolved. I also hope profoundly that an iPad in my kids' hands in 25 years is not state of the art. So when we think about the acceleration of technologies, and when we think about how quickly things are going to change, and we think about the permanence of physical architecture, Ron, you asked a really interesting question. What do technologists, architects, and educators have to learn from each other? I think we've spent a remarkable time together talking about the challenges for educators. I don't think we've talked enough about the new style of conversations that need to happen between technologists and architects. We should not presume that we know what right looks like. And I'll share a very specific example, going to ground. Beautiful polished concrete floors, super durable, very attractive, aesthetically pleasing. Break computer vision technologies. The IR reflectivity in that flooring makes people disappear when they walk across it. There are unknown unknowns that we as disciplines have no context of because we simply haven't had the conversations yet. And somebody mentioned earlier, where do we prototype? Or forgive me, I can't remember who mentioned it. We don't open schools where people fall downstairs. If we don't do the work, we actually will create situations that maybe aren't that physical in their disruption, but systems will break. So when we step back and we think about buildings as platforms to deliver education, Satya, your point about do we diversify that platform in interesting ways? Yes, but I would say that there are profound challenges that we have not yet begun to tackle simply because we haven't had the right heads in a conversation together. And Cheryl, you mentioned, we don't have the vocabulary to talk about this. Yes, that is very true. Globally, from an education design perspective, we don't have the vocabulary. Architects and technologists don't yet share the appropriate vocabulary. the place that I think is doing a good job of bringing physical and digital together is more object oriented, and probably the most advanced benchmark would be autonomous vehicles, where people are actually working in tandem and changing the nature of both the technology and the physicality. That's not really happening as aggressively as I think it needs to keep up with this conversation when you're thinking about architectural scale. So I'm excited to begin to have that more specific design conversation. What does right look like? And again, no less profound than bringing electricity and plumbing to the physical plant.
So Heidi, I'm sorry to say that we only get 2 questions from the observers today, but thank you for your hard work. And I know that you spent a lot of time to narrow it down just to that. So we do want to finish up close to being on our close time. And so before we part, I've asked the panelists to join me in a round robin. Just a headline, what's a nugget that you really want us to take out of today's conversation? And since we're not sitting around the table, so we can't go clockwise, I will call on you. Think headlines, not New Yorker articles. And Dan, we're going to start with you. Be a good model, Dan, and give us a good, tight response.
Absolutely. So I kind of typed it into the chat there, but when I talk about like breaking the form of school, this traditional idea as to what school is has guided how we build our architectural buildings and how we have developed all of our instructional systems and research and everything. If we're going to make something better, then we have to rethink what that form of school is into something that is more creative, is more challenge-based, is more providing opportunities for kids to kind of crawl inside and pull apart these problems, as opposed to just, I'm going to write this down and go through it and check the box and do it. Okay. We can talk about compliance or we can talk about engagement. I think we need to talk about engagement.
Very good. Thank you. Cheryl.
I'm going to try to be concise, Ron, and take your orders from headquarters here. My headline is, people need to talk to more people and quit thinking they know what to do, because I know. I'm the all-knowing, all-being. And that this conversation to me has been incredibly powerful. And I am Zoomed and GoToMeetinged out almost. But this has been the most critical, important, pivotal conversation I've been a part of probably in the last 2 years. Because it's people like Ashley and Ace and Joshua who's bringing us all together, all of you, with educators to talk about so people need to talk to more people to help make sure we do the right things more of the time. We're not going to do it all the time, more of the time. So people talk to people.
Good. Satya.
Yeah, I think building on something that Ashley said, I think with new technology and technology platforms, I think one of the things that's changed with digital technology is the idea of scale, but also like how they evolve over time, right? I think it's important to remember that Facebook was literally the replacement for like the college Facebook when it came out, right? And it's like, it's grown into this huge platform where people have media and conversations and talk to each other and hardware. But it started out, by doing something very ubiquitous, very small, and it grew into what it is, right? Same thing with Uber. Uber was a carpool app that became like this, ride sharing, change, and there's good and bad that came with it, right? So I think one of the things we can think about as we think about technology at scale is, finding small and broad applications, which also helps address equity because it keeps everyone raising together, and really platform it. Like, let it start small and wide, and then find the opportunities that emerge when you connect 30 million school children together, even at the simplest level, and then build on top of that platform.
Good. Thank you, Dr. Ray.
Okay. Mine would be to be sensitive to the people involved and be more inclusive and less siloed. We are fundamentally bureaucratic and siloed, and that needs to stop. Make no assumptions. We do a lot of that too, especially with the technology, that it's going to be able to be all and all, and it is not. and to lean into existing models and best practices. There are a lot of effective practices out there. They may not be in the field of education or architecture for that matter. I've gone into medicine and engineering and a lot of other fields to tap in and bring them into what I'm doing in my work. So those would be my pearls.
Thank you so much. John Sievertson.
Okay, really simple. Let's use the pandemic experience.
Okay. We want to get back to you on that. Ashley Arhart.
Two thoughts, and I'm jumping on the Satya bandwagon here. I think place as platform, as an aspiration for the design practitioners in the conversation, and really challenging our previous expectations about what's possible. And in terms of, it's such a complicated discussion because in many ways there's so many urgent, immediate needs, but there's this amazing future. So really determining our aspiration and working the entirety of that spectrum, I think is going to be a profound challenge. And so much of this more future-leaning stuff can feel so esoteric. And at the same time, it's critically important to put our heads in that space because there are thorny challenges that will take a long time to figure out together. And the last little parting shot I would have is, it always seems impossible until suddenly it isn't. And I think these thinkers are the ones to bring to bear to make this new future possible.
Thank you. Heidi, do you have any thoughts you'd like to share?
Oh, I just want to keep the conversation going. Actually, can we do a part 2 of this?
I think we need to do 2, 3, and a 4.
I'll pass for now.
Okay, thanks. Thanks again for working with me on this. It was fun. Ace, it's your turn.
Yes, so I think I would just build on what Ashley mentioned in terms of some of those thorny issues and quote my favorite fake scientist, Dr. Ian Malcolm from Jurassic Park, who said wisely at one point that just because you can doesn't mean you should. And so I think we need to be able to be really thoughtful about what is the function technology plays and what should technology not do, because our capability is that technology can do everything. But one of the fundamental purposes of education and schools is we teach people to be human beings. And we attend to those relational and the academic purposes. Now, technology can facilitate a lot of that, make some of that stronger, but we need to start with the end in mind and think about what is the experience we want our young people to have and design and think about how technology facilitates that rather than, again, like starting with the technology and saying, what can we do with this?
Great. Thank you, Ace. Dr. Dennison.
Did you say Marilyn?
Marilyn?
Yeah, okay. Space matters. So space and technology are the nudges to change behavior, but they must come with a clear vision, identified expectations and practices, and ongoing professional development support.
That was very concise. Thank you. Dr. Ramirez.
Yes, thank you. I think one thing I'm definitely leading with, and I put this in the chat, is we just all need to be reminded that there is a sense of urgency. The child sitting in the 3rd grade class doesn't get a do-over. This is their normal. This is their life. Whereas the adults feel like they entered the twilight zone, we need to embrace the twilight zone. And I think this group of individuals and so many more that aren't on here can be part of that conversation and part of that solution. And our students are depending on us.
Thanks, Lisa. And Joshua Elder.
Yeah, tough to follow all of that. But I think for me, building off of what I've heard is that we can't go backwards, but we can only go forward with a strategic plan and a clear vision that intentionally allows for intersectionality between learning, design, and technology, and includes voices of all stakeholders, including students and families, which I know we just briefly touched on, but just really getting to that equity piece, making sure that everyone has to be at the table for us to plan this new way forward.
Thank you all. This is the beginning, as I started out saying. This is not just a single event where we're talking, but it's the launch of an ongoing dialogue. Reimagine America Schools is operating in 2 broad phases. We're currently in the ideation phase, where we're doing this, we're talking to folks, we're hearing, we're trying to create inspiring, uplifting, useful visions that thoughtful civic and education leaders can learn from, can gain from, and maybe even help guide their steps forward. Then we have the implementation phase, where we take these ideas and we begin to work directly with communities, teachers, students, parents, and others, the stakeholders that can help see these ideas made real. Just for your quick information, we do have several other events that we have coming up that we'd invite you to participate in. We're dealing with several drivers. One of them is technology. Our next convening is on September 15th, where we're looking at design and equity, and how do we actively engage the design of the physical space, the infrastructure, to support and create bridges to provide greater equity and opportunity. We're also looking at the whole issue of crisis preparedness. Schools become the ad hoc center for community support. How do we need to think about the design of that infrastructure so that it's more able to be repurposed during times of crisis? And finally, continuing to look at other drivers like makerspace and STEM and STEAM, and how have these become a more active part of how we think about education, and how does the environment, how does the learning space help support that? And finally, we have a very big project we're working on with citizen schools. I'll give you a teaser. If we were to invent public education today, it certainly wouldn't look like the public education that we have, but what would it look like? So we're very excited to be working with this great group of folks at Citizen Schools to reimagine what our schools should look like. If you want to follow us, our website is reimagineschools.us. There's an opportunity to sign up so you'll get our newsletters and information about our future convenings. Thank you all. It is 2:32. I'm so sorry we ran late, but it was so good. Thanks and goodbye. Take care, everybody. Be well.
Bye.
Thanks, Ron.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.